Good evening all, and welcome. Day 2 of the competition is upon us, and we are joined by the incredibly talented Fear Crawler today. You'll find a link to his work at the end of the video and in the description, so when you're done here, please go over and check him out. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable. Lock your doors, ignore those knocks, and let the darkness take control. This happened about 15 years ago, when my girls were still small. Their mother had passed away very recently, and the grief and pain were still very much inflicting every corner of our lives. It is so very difficult to move on when you lose someone that close. But I was still a father, and tried my best every day to do what I could to keep my two girls happy, and life ticking along as normal. The girls went to an after-school club. Being the only parent, I needed them to stay late so that I could pick them up from work, and establish some kind of balance without my wife being there anymore. This happened during the winter. It was a regular Thursday, and I was just pulling up to the school. I got out of my car and picked up my two girls. During the drive home, we were making small talk and asking them how their day was. To any parent who has kids, you know that most of the time they'll reply with either something along the lines of, "School was boring," and when you ask the other question, "What did you learn?" they'll most likely say, "Nothing." As was the same with my girls. However, today, one of them said something that really got to me. My youngest, Jane. Jane, who is about 6 at this point, says that she was playing in the playground with her friends when there were two kids who were outside of school, i.e. on the other side of the fence, who were supposed to be in school. I asked her what she meant, and she said that there were these two kids who were about 10 and 7, who were just staring at all the other kids, wearing these thick grey hoodies, just watching all the children. She said that this kind of freaked her out a little bit, and she was more pissed than anything, because she thought that they should be in school. Because of course, as a 6-year-old, other children in school means only two things. One, that they're being bad, or two, that if they're not in school, why should she be in school? Oh, clever Jane. Anyway, I kind of brushed this off and pushed it to the back of my mind, not really thinking about it, and trying to focus more on what I was going to cook the girls for dinner, and wondering if there were still any leftovers from the night before. We get into the driveway, I close the front fence, and in we go. The girls do their homework as I start preparing dinner. After a pretty regular evening of eating, homework checking, and TV time, we're all sat on the couch, pretty much exhausted. By this point it's about 9 p.m, and I am shameful to admit that I was starting to doze off in front of the TV. It was some kid show the girls wanted to watch, and it had successfully put me into a very deep sleep. The girls were running around, and I hear knocking, but I assume that it's just them playing, so I kind of close my eyes and get comfortable on the sofa again. After a few minutes, it definitely sounds like they're talking to someone. I press a button on the remote, and it tells me that it's already 10:15 p.m. Shit, these girls shouldn't be in bed. I turn off the TV, rub my eyes, and slowly start to get up. That's when my ears tune into something. At the door, the girls are talking to someone. Apparently, someone wants to come in. I rush over to the front door, because I've already told my girls never to open it for anyone and to always ask me. Why the hell have they done it this time? They should know better. I rush over and look down. Thank goodness it's still closed. But through the window it's very clear to see that my two girls are talking to these two hooded figures. They're not particularly tall, and I instantly assumed that they were children. I got a very nervous feeling just standing there, and I asked my girls what was going on. Jane was quick to pipe up. "These are the girls from the school. I told you, Dad. I'm asking them why they weren't in school, but they just want to come in." This is a bit weird, I think. And then Emma chimes in. "Dad, I'm scared. Don't let them in." I tell my girls to rush upstairs and go put their pajamas on and get ready for bed, and that I will deal with this. Obediently, they both run off. I look down and ask them what they want, hesitant about opening the door. Why are two kids awake at this hour, without their parents and wandering the streets? Part of me wanted to open the door, invite them in, get them warm and call their parents. But there was something just so strange about this whole situation. I can't even describe what it was, but there was a palpable feeling of dread within me. Something which should not be akin to two small children. Suddenly, the taller of the two speaks up. "Excuse me, sir. We need to come in. We've lost our mummy, and we're so cold." "Okay," I reply. "Well, do you know her phone number? Perhaps I should get in touch, and she can come and collect you quickly." There's a pause, and a brief silence. It's almost as if they didn't hear me. "Please, sir, we need to come in and call our mummy." Okay. Do you know her number? I'm sure we can figure this out." Still no reply. Still eerie silence after I ask for her number. This is beginning to feel extremely dodgy. I'd read a story in the newspaper that people put these child baskets in the middle of the road and leave them as bait for people to come out of their car and then be attacked or abducted, or at least get their car stolen. I wondered if this was a similar situation, where children were knocking on doors in the middle of the night for unsuspecting parents to open their doors and then be the target of some attack. This was definitely giving me creepy vibes, and I was now more adamant to not open the door. I told the two hooded children as a last resort that if they wanted to, they can go around and open the back door and sit on the back porch to be safe, but I didn't want to let them in, and they could only do that on the condition that they gave me their mother's number, or I'd have to call the police and have them taken to the station so that they can find out where they belong. When I said that, there was silence again. "Please, Brian, we need to come in and use your phone. We're cold." The window on my door is completely transparent, not one of those funky windows that you can't see out of properly. And when the tallest of the two looks me in the eyes, her eyes are pitch black. Keep in mind that we have a porch light, and it's very clear to see that there are no whites to her eyes, no colours, no nothing, just two pools of infinite darkness staring up at me. I start panicking. This is otherworldly. This isn't right. I start to stutter and tell the two hooded children that I'm sorry I couldn't help them and to try another door. I quickly close the blind to our door window and walk away. I go upstairs and check on my girls. Both of them are in bed, trying to fall asleep, but they can't. Just like me, the tapping on the door and the calling of my name is getting quite chilling. The way my bedroom is positioned, I can look down my window and see directly onto the porch, and there they are, both looking straight up at me. I think this is insane, and I call the police, telling them that there are two children who have been dropped off or left or abandoned or something, and that someone needs to come and collect them. The person on the phone asks if this is a prank, and when I tell them that it's not, she says that someone should be there soon. It took all of 20 minutes for the sirens to start rolling down the road. I kept looking at the two hooded figures, on and off during that time. The moment I heard the sirens, did they start walking away. The police reached my house, and I saw them walking into the distance. I ran down the stairs and pointed in the direction that they just left in. The police quickly gave chase, but never found the two hooded figures. They asked if I was joking or not, as they weren't really sure if this was a real call. And that's when my youngest comes down the stairs and says, "No, officer, Daddy's telling the truth. I saw them outside the gates of school, and then they came to my house." This little detail really got the officer, as he said that it sounded extremely dodgy. He patrolled the area and assured us that they'd keep a lookout to make sure that they didn't come back, and that if they did, to call straight away and to never answer the door. To this day, I'm unsure whether this is some kind of paranormal or unexplainable event, or perhaps a sinister plot on their parents' part to maybe rob the house, or worse, take me or my girls. I honestly don't know what to believe. It was only years later that I heard of other people who had encountered children with pitch black eyes, and it made me wonder if they are perhaps something a bit more supernatural than I originally anticipated. Nonetheless, I never do want to meet them again.
I'm originally from Ireland. I moved to the States roughly 20 years back. This story takes place in County Clare, Ireland, when I was about 15 years old. One afternoon, I was walking through the woods near my home. I was alone. I was a loner in my youth, and I would often stroll in the woods until I found a tree to sit beneath and write. Writing has always been my hobby. My point is that I was very familiar with these woods. I felt safe there. On this particular day, I was walking a path to a specific tree that was my favorite to sit beneath. The sounds of the woods were all around me. There was a gentle breeze, and while I couldn't see the birds, I could hear them. It was comforting. And then, it all stopped. Everything became unnaturally still. The air was still. The birds stopped twittering. I no longer heard a single thing. I had never experienced this before. It was as if I had suddenly become deaf. There was just nothing. No sound. No movement. No breeze. At this point, I had started to become anxious. I wasn't yet afraid, but I started home anyway. The feeling in the woods was not what I was used to. I was no longer comforted, so I decided to go home. It was then that I saw movement from the corner of my eye. Nothing I could pinpoint, but a dark shape that was just there. And then it wasn't. Everything else was still that eerie calm. I started to walk faster, and then the black shape again, this time on my other side. Now I was afraid. I began to run. I still heard nothing, but I was sure something was chasing me. When I reached my home, I ran inside and slammed the door, fully expecting my mom to yell at me for slamming. But she wasn't there. In fact, nobody was home. That was a bit odd, but not unheard of. Finally gaining some sanity, I decided I needed tea. Now. So I began to boil the water for tea, and then there was a knock at the door. I jumped. My heart rose to my throat. Nobody knocked in these parts. It was a small village where everyone knew everyone else. Everyone was family. There was no knocking. There was a friendly, "Oi there," and then people came in, so a knock was strange. I crept over to the glass in the door and peeked out. I noticed two things right away that terrified and confused me. The first was a child, a girl of maybe 10 or 12, looking not at me but at her feet. The second thing scared me to my toes. It was getting dark. How was that possible? I had left to go on my walk in midday. The sun had been fully out and I had been gone no longer than 40 minutes. How then was it dark? I looked at the clock. It was almost 7. How? How had I misplaced 5 hours? The knock came again and I jumped again. I didn't open the door. I called out, "Oi there, can I help you?" The girl didn't look up. She said, "I need to come in. Please, let me in." She had no accent. She wasn't Irish. There was no lilt to her voice. She sounded American. I called out again, "I can't let you in, but I'll ring someone if you need help." The child still didn't look up. She said, "No, that won't work. I need to come in." At this point, I had had enough of the strange, scary child. She was freaking me out. I wanted my mom. I wanted my dad. I wanted to know where 5 hours of my life had gone, and I was so frightened at this point that not even tea was going to help. So I did what any teenage girl would do when faced with a situation such as this. I screamed and ran to my bed, covered myself with my blanket and waited for my mom to come home. This was pre-cellular phones, and I was not going to risk going to the kitchen to phone someone. Plus, I had no idea who I would call. The girl was still knocking on the door, but she never moved to a window or to the back door. She stayed at the front door. After a while, I got my nerve up to go check again. It had been silent for a bit. I went to the door and looked out the glass. The girl was still there, but she was no longer at the door. She was sitting on the fence. She was no longer looking down. She was looking right at me, and in the fading light, it looked like her eyes were pitch black. I screamed again and ran back to the safety of my blanket. Eventually, my mom came home. I told her what had happened. She decided that it was my overactive imagination, but she did call down to the shops and the pubs to find out if anyone in town had an American family visiting, or if anyone knew who the girl was. Nobody did. My grandmother told me I had survived an encounter with the Fae, or fairies, and that I was lucky. She was the only one who ever believed me. I never saw the girl again. I never had missing time again. I never felt the absolute stillness in the woods again when I got up my courage to go back. After I moved to the States and years later, I heard of black-eyed children. My story seemed to coincide with that, but that's ridiculous, right? I still have no explanation. Demon? Fairy? The Fae are said to be evil and will kidnap children, and the woods was near a fairy hill. A ghost? Black-eyed child? I don't know. But it happened. I swear to that.
I had a seriously strange encounter last night. I ordered a frozen yogurt from Postmates, which is a food delivery service, at around 10:45 p.m. At around 11:20, I received a notification the delivery driver was close, so my girlfriend and I stood at the curb waiting for our food. I was immediately surprised to see that my delivery guy was driving a brand new Jaguar. I have never seen a Postmates delivery driver in such an expensive car, as I'm sure many of you probably haven't seen either. The driver also had a young, seemingly normal-looking man as a passenger. When the driver got out, he moved bizarrely slow, and the entirety of his eyes were black. It were as if his pupils had expanded to cover the entirety of the visible area of his eyeball. The worst part, however, was that everything that this guy did was horrifyingly creepy. I have never met a creepier individual. When he exited the car, he said something along the lines of, "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by." This statement made no sense, because I had just ordered food from him. Also, the guy put my frozen yogurt in the trunk. Keep in mind the item is small enough to fit into a cup holder. So why would he put it in the trunk when it can easily fit right by him? Then he slowly fished around the trunk for my yogurt. My girlfriend said he stopped what he was doing, looked up, and stared at her, with what she described as an extremely creepy grin for a significant amount of time. I was looking somewhere else at this point, because I just thought the guy was weird and wanted to keep my contact with him to a minimum. I chalked up the creepiness to the guy being socially off, and the eyes to a medical condition. However, my girlfriend was absolutely petrified and told me about these black-eyed people she'd heard about. I don't know what his deal was, but I'd rather never see him or anyone like that again.
It was March of 2013 up here in the Great White North of Ontario. It was the aftermath of a really bad snowstorm. Canadian winters are extremely cold up here. I had ventured out to do some groceries with my 4-year-old daughter who is mildly autistic. It was a weekend for sure because my husband was home, and he only comes home on weekends as he works the week out of town. When this happened, he was visiting his father at the old age home he lives in. Back to the story. I know about black-eyed kids. I've been reading about them for a few years, so when I pulled into the driveway, car full of groceries and a 4-year-old, and saw the black man walking down the middle of the road, wearing a pair of blue shorts and a faded red hoodie, socks with sandals, of course I freaked. My first thought was he was some sort of junkie that wandered out of a not-so-great area of town to my nice little suburb. The thing is, everyone knows everyone in our area. We look out for each other. This man was not only underdressed and completely unfamiliar to me, but he was acting really strange. He was walking up and down the street approaching the same 3 doors of my neighbors' homes, directly across the road from my home, but not knocking or anything, just walking to their doors, then leaving, going to the next and the next, then starting at the first house again and repeating the same actions, going to their doors and just standing there staring at them, as if not knowing what to do. Finally, after watching him for about 5 minutes, I got out of my car, leaving my door open, and said, "Excuse me, what are you doing? And do you need any help with anything?" When he heard me, he just stopped dead in his tracks, turned around and stared at me as if he had just realized there was another side to the road. At this point, my daughter began crying and shouting, "Mommy in car! Mommy, hurry in car!" At the same time she began crying for me to get back in the car. I looked this man directly in the eyes. They were coal black, and his face was emotionless. I was filled with a terror so profound that I can't even think of a word to describe exactly how I was feeling. I couldn't break eye contact with him, and the only thing that stopped me from approaching him was my daughter screaming bloody murder in my car, which snapped me right back to reality. I turned and climbed into my car, locked the doors, leaned over and released my daughter from her car seat, and helped her climb up front with me to have her close to me. The man just stood there staring at us. It was the worst feeling in the world having him look at us. After a couple of minutes of him watching us, he went right back to his repetitive behavior of walking up to my across-the-road neighbors' doors, but not knocking, just standing there and staring at them. I called my mom and told her what I was seeing, and then I called my husband who was already on his way home and told him to hurry because we were afraid to get out of the car. When my husband said he was on his way, the man looked at us like he could hear my husband telling me he was coming, then simply started walking away. Ironically, as soon as the man in the red hoodie was out of my sight, my husband, followed by the police, came speeding from the direction the man had only momentarily just walked in, and they saw nothing. He had just vanished. I was telling this story to a friend who was renting out my basement. I found that he had also seen this man too, right down to the shorts and the red hoodie, and the weird repetitive behavior going to my neighbor's doors, the same 3 houses, and just staring at the doors. He was a smoker who suffered from insomnia and was out about 1 a.m. in the morning. He also confronted him. The man did the same thing to him upon my boarder confronting him, causing him so much fear he dropped his cigarette, came in, locked the door, and never went outside at night again without one of our dogs with him.
I used to do ghost investigations with a foundation for paranormal research, so I was used to going into dark places and trying to come up with rational explanations. The stories about black-eyed kids had intrigued me, and I always felt a bit uneasy when thinking that they were real. What that could mean. So a co-worker and I were having a discussion about paranormal topics, and I thought about the BEKs. This guy was a bit gullible, and was a little spooked by some of the stories of my investigating adventures. I told him that I wanted to talk with him about the subject, but if I didn't, he might be a target for those dark forces, and he'd have to agree before I tell him to alleviate any guilt of my part if something strange were to happen. He agreed. I told him about the BEKs and some stories I'd read over the previous years, and then embellishing it and saying, now that I've told you them, you'll get some kind of visit within 3 days. He laughed it off and kind of didn't believe me, although I saw a nervousness on his face. 2 days passed, and then on the third I told him, today's the day, and he had actually forgotten all about it, and we laughed about it a bit, making woo scary ghost noises. So I go home, do some chores around the house, and then went upstairs to do some exercise. I was just on the treadmill at the time, and I was binge watching Friends on Netflix. The episode was almost over, and the TV sort of just faded out to black, and I thought maybe the power was acting up, or the TV just went kaput, when I heard the most sinister child giggling that turned into a sort of demonic high laugh, kind of half and half. There on my TV screen was a picture of a red-headed, freckled 10 to 12-year-old kid with solid black eyes. The picture was sort of zoomed in and turned on a slight angle, as if you had tilted your head to the side. It just stayed there, and I jumped off the treadmill and onto the sides of the equipment, and just stared at it with my mouth agape. The laugh giggled again, and then it faded out, and Friends faded back in, and the end credits were about to roll, sort of picking up where it had left off. The whole thing happened in about 30 seconds. I couldn't sleep. I went over and over it in my mind, that somehow I got the visit from the black-eyed kids, but not in person as one would think. I could only hear that demonic giggle laughter in my head over and over, and literally scared myself. I told my co-worker about it, and he then thought I was making it up. I scoured the internet for a photo that looked just like what I saw, and while my photoshopping skills are limited, I managed to recreate it. We were both very spooked.
I just recently found out about BEK phenomena, and was reminded of this story told to me by my grandfather of an incident that took place sometime in late 1918 or early 1919, near Sandoval, Illinois. He told me it had been hot the past summer, and the heat lingered for months, so he had all the windows and both doors open on his house. He was sitting on the porch reading a book because it was too stuffy to be inside. He went in to make a snack and get a drink, when he heard a knock. This struck him as odd because most people would just call out that knew him, so he figured it was a vagrant looking for a meal or labor. He lived by the train tracks, so hobos would come from time to time, and I guess it was normal. So he goes to the hall and 2 kids are standing in the entranceway and call out, "May we come in to rest? It's a long way home." So he says they are welcome to sit on the porch because it's too hot inside to be comfortable. He asked if they came from the rails, and they just said, "We need to come in. May we?" From what he said, the kids made him feel peculiar because, 1, they wouldn't look at him directly, and 2, they were too clean. My grandfather said that riding the trains was dirty. You got grease on you and coal dust, and sometimes you get cuts on your hands or knees. He lost his leg doing that very thing, which kept him out of the war. But these kids, from what he said, were pristine, like they were going to Sunday school. They weren't sweating and their hair was neat, and it struck him as odd if they had walked in the open fields in the middle of the heat, they wouldn't be unkempt or disheveled. He asked again if they would like to sit on the porch. And the girl, it was a boy and a girl, but the boy didn't speak, just repeated, "May we come in?" And then she just kept asking, "May we? May we? May we?" over and over again until my grandfather slammed his hands down and says, "Damn you both. No." The girl stopped speaking, and he said they both just stood quiet until the girl looked at him, eyes black like coal, and said once more, "Mister, may we please come in?" My grandfather just walked to the kitchen and sat down, not knowing what to do. He said he felt like someone punched him in the stomach. He said he sat there until his dog came rushing in the house, shaking like a leaf. So at the end, he never told anyone, chalking it up to heat exhaustion. But he said it troubled him for years. My question is, how far back do stories of BEK go? And from what I've read, they can sometimes hypnotize people. Could they also do that with a dog to keep it from barking a warning?
I live in rural Vermont, and I am an amateur author. It's my hobby, you could say. But I've been interested in black-eyed kids for quite some time, and wanted to write a book about it. However, I've been doing research on them for about a week now, and 2 nights ago my wife and I were awoken by a knock on the front door at about 2:40 a.m. It was a pretty loud knock, not smashing, just 3 loud thuds. I told my wife I'd go downstairs and check it out. However, when I got closer to the door, I had an odd sensation of fear come over me. It was very strange. I can't really explain the feeling. I hesitated for a moment, but then I buckled up and opened the door, and to my surprise it was just a kid. At first I thought it was the neighbour's kid who lived down the street, as he's roughly the age of 13 to 14. He had his head down and was wearing a dark grey hoodie, and I asked him kind of angrily what he wanted. He then continued to stand there and said nothing. I raised my voice and asked him what his name was. That's when he looked up at me. I don't believe I've ever felt fear like that before in my life. His eyes were completely black, not to mention his very pale skin. I slammed the door in his face, locked, and then deadbolted. This was definitely not my neighbour's son. I then proceeded to run back upstairs, right by the wife, and lock the window to see if he was gone. And he was, just like that, gone. I've barely gotten any sleep, and can't stop thinking about this, and just can't make sense of it. I've since stopped all research for obvious reasons, but I thought I would share this experience with you, and see if you guys have any thoughts on it. I have 3 stories from my own friends who've had interactions with these beings. Firstly, in Eugene, Oregon, my friend Amy told me about her interaction with a BEK, and this is amazing because the BEK had black skin. It's the only example I've ever seen of this case. So, this being knocked on her door late one night and simply asked for water. Amy brought her some water in a glass. The being drank it, set the glass down, and walked off into the night. All black eyes, of course. Secondly, my friend in Grant Pass, Oregon, David, had a classic experience in a car when 2 young boys with black eyes knocked on the windows and wanted in. He just got terrified and locked the doors and drove away. Now the third story involves my Aunt Rosie in Medford, Oregon. One day she gets the knock at the door, and it's 2 little girls dressed like Little House on the Prairie, and they've got the antique baby buggy with little dolls in it. My Aunt Rosie asked the girls if they were okay, and they asked for water to drink. My Aunt Rosie asked if they wanted to come inside. They said no. Could they just have some water to drink? She goes to the back and grabs 2 bottles of water from the fridge, returns, gives them the water bottles, and the girls proceed to guzzle the water down like hungry wolves. My aunt turns from the baby buggy to where she was doting on the dolls and sees them doing this, and tells them they can just take the water with them. And that surprises the girls greatly. They said okay, and wandered back down the long driveway. My aunt closes the door, then thinks, those girls could have been angels. Reopens the door, and they're gone. Just gone. And this is too long a driveway for them to just disappear like that, unlike other houses on the street. She asked around the neighborhood after that, and nobody ever knew of the girls nor had seen them. I asked if she knew what black-eyed kids were, and she said no. I asked her if their eyes were normal, and she said no, that they were all black.
I lived really far out of my small town when I was a kid. There weren't any street lamps, and I didn't ride my bike home much at night due to a couple of strange happenings. One night my ride decided he didn't like me anymore and changed his mind about giving me a ride home from our gathering. I was in high school, so we were smoking weed in my friend's basement and watching a movie. I confronted him about his change of attitude towards me in school. Anyways, I gave it a couple of hours before I decided to be on my way. My parents never gave me rides at night because they always started drinking at 5:30, so rides had to be arranged by then. So I'm riding my bike home when I get towards the bridge that goes over the road to my house, and I get a feeling of absolute dread. I call my dad to beg him to get me again. The phone's ringing and I can see the bridge. Underneath it, I see a bunch of weird fucking lights. Like someone was having a bonfire party, but there wasn't any noise. At this point, I'm on the phone with my dad crying and telling him what's going on, and just pleading him to come get me because I was right down the hill. He wouldn't. I sat on my bike freaking out before I start pedaling and pass under the bridge. I get out from underneath it, and there's no lights. There's a minivan pulled over on the dirt shoulder. Doors open, lights on inside. I feel a little relieved, but still have a strange feeling. I think about just passing by on my bike, but I stop by the van and ask people inside if they're okay. They said no. I ask if they need help. They say no. The only person that talked was the grown man sitting in the back, or maybe he was outside of the van. I honestly don't remember much about that night, which is weird, because it was the strangest thing in the world. I guess I try not to think about it much. It's weird because part of me recalls seeing every seat in the van being filled, leaving no room for the man outside, unless my memory is betraying me. Just so you know, I'm typing as I remember things, so sorry if it's jumbled up. And he was sitting in the back, but I don't think that's the case. Either way, it's odd because, besides an older woman in front of everyone else, there was children. The children were the weirdest part. They just stared at me the whole time. Totally unsettling. Also, why was there a kid sitting up front when the man would probably sit there? So yeah, the kids definitely looked fucking weird as shit, and I'm not sure if it was the single ceiling light on in the van, but they looked like black-eyed kids. Everyone just stared at me except for the woman in the front seat, who I never took a hard look at, but I remember reddish-brown hair, and she was a bit big. She just faced forward. Nobody said anything for a long time after I asked if they needed help, if their car was stuck or whatever. I just got a stern no every time. I remember feeling the blood running out of my face, and thinking I must look white as a sheet, and that every hair on my body was sticking up. I was fucking terrified, and I still don't really know why. They just had a strange vibe. I don't remember if I even said goodbye, but I've never rode my bike up that hill faster. It was an exhausting ride to my house, but I didn't stop for 1 second. Once I got my bike into the gate, I tried to tell my parents what happened, but I remember just being so confused. I could recall like half of what went down, and I probably just sat there with my head in my hands bumbling like a crazy person. I had no air in my lungs from breathing all that cold air pedaling my ass off. I lived in a shed outside when I was a teenager, and it gets fucking cold during the winter in Colorado. So I gave up and went in there to turn on the space heater. And I don't remember anything else. That experience happened in the same area I saw a giant figure run off the road, and I could hear it fucking ripping its way along the river's edge, all the way down to the end of the road. I don't remember which event occurred first. Hell, they could have been on the same night. Probably happened right when I turned the corner to go up the hill, and I saw those people. Sorry again for the shitty writing.
As a kid, I always had these dreams of black-eyed children knocking on my front door asking to use my phone. They started off fairly polite, but as the dreams occurred more often, they got very demanding about it. There were things about my dreams that always stumped me. My dad's car would be parked somewhere differently than normal. It wouldn't be there at all, or be where it should not be. After a while I started waking up and actually opening the door to let them in. And wherever my dad's car was in the dream, it actually was. I always fell asleep before he got home, so I'd have no way of knowing if he was actually home from work or not, let alone exactly where his car was parked. That's basically where it ended as a kid. I just had those really vivid dreams and always remember feeling uneasy in that house. Fast forward about 15 years later, and I'm having those same dreams again, except they won't come near the house and just stand in my yard at my bedroom window. They ask the normal questions, if they can come in, if they can use the phone, and it's always the same story where my mum needs to know where they are, and it's the same kids from my childhood dreams. It always ends up saying, soon, and then they're gone. So just tonight I start feeling really uneasy, as if someone's watching me as I'm walking to work, which is odd because I live in a nice area and never get that vibe. Well, as I get a bit further down the road, I go into a full-blown panic attack, for no reason, and I see this kid standing at the overpass, down the road from my house in the pitch black, as I was using my phone for a flashlight. I get closer and he asks if he can use my phone. So I hop on my skateboard and just take off. I hear him say again loudly, "We weren't lying," and then he vanishes out of nowhere. Immediately, my uneasy feeling goes away, and my panic attack stops. Do these spirits, or whatever the hell they are, sometimes latch onto people? It's been a long time since I last experienced any of this. I thought it was over, but apparently not.
This happened a couple of weeks ago when myself and two of my partners, who will be referred to as K and W, decided on visiting this 150-year-old graveyard at night. Now, I'm a sensitive, empath, indigo, whatever. W and K are blocked off energy-wise. The walk in the cemetery was dark and peaceful. At first, we wandered a while and read some stones, and eventually at a crossroads, K noticed something and walked off. He came back and whispered, "There's someone over there. I'm going to check it out." The moment he walked away again, I felt eyes watching me from everywhere, and an overwhelming primal sense of fear. I froze, and W strained to see what K was looking at. About 7 or 8 minutes later, K was back and looking spooked. He told me that there was a stone-white figure darting through the trees. I was asked if I wanted to leave, and I said no. So we stayed and wandered a little more. After a little longer, we came across this huge marble mausoleum, the door of which was made of glass, and you could see through it. Getting closer set me off. Everything felt wrong, and the dread was back. There was an extremely prickly feeling all over my skin. Kay touched the door and felt it too. Both Kay and myself saw a shadow moving around inside the mausoleum as we stood there, and the moment he touched the door, the shadow disappeared. We ran, eventually finding a place to sit for a moment. I was completely overwhelmed and continuing to feel like we were being watched. Kay was really freaking out, getting dizzy and very quiet. He seemed really off, like he'd seen something I hadn't. I was asked again if I wanted to leave, and this time I said yes. We left, and the whole walk home, myself and Kay felt the dread again, that inhuman primal fear. Once we got home, W immediately fell asleep on the couch while Kay and I began to panic. Both of us felt extremely dizzy and weak. And then, knocking. It started softly, only 3. As time went on, it got more and more frantic sounding, but not much harder. We couldn't shake the dread for a good 30 minutes or so. When the dread left, we were left drained mentally and physically, and decided to go upstairs and attempting to get some sleep. We assured each other that if it was a BEK, that we didn't open the door, thus we were safe. At some point while watching TV to try and calm down, I got overheated, and Kay opened the door to the upstairs patio and turned on the fan. That was another thing we did wrong. Around 3:20 a.m., Kay woke up, and he remembers only being able to move his head around. The door had opened on its own about halfway, and a child who looked about 12, with extremely messy shortish hair and face covered by a shadow, was standing there and staring. He remembers the most intense terror he's ever felt, so much that it physically hurt. He shut his eyes and held them closed until the terror passed and he fell back asleep. The house was already haunted, but the activity had been kicked up a notch or 2. The cat goes nuts because of it. Since then, for both me and Kay, depression and anxiety has become much more intense than it has been in a very long time. I can't sleep at night, and neither can Kay. There's been a constant dull ringing in my ears. Occasionally dread so bad it hurts will take over Kay for 20 to 30 minutes, and I've been having random pains in various parts of my abdomen. TVs, radios, and lights turn on and off by themselves, and we are both constantly feeling watched and intense fear. I can't find any sources on how to deal with or get rid of BEKs. I also practice witchcraft, and nothing I've done, casting circles, salt, cleanings, etc., has worked. Whatever BEKs are, whatever they want, is having effects on our physical and mental health. I feel so drained. Someone, tell me what to do. Please.
I want to share a story my dad has been telling my family for a long time. This took place in 2003, 15 years ago. We used to live in Mexico, more specifically, in Mexicali, Baja California. We lived in an urban area. This story is a bit different since he saw a woman instead of a child, but nonetheless, I'm sure it's the same thing. One afternoon, after my father was doing his usual stuff, he heard knocking on the door. He quickly answered and was met with a Caucasian woman, a bit on the chubby side, wearing some really old clothes that looked handmade and clearly weren't from this time period. She told him, "Me da agua, señor?" which translates to, "Can I have some water?" My father replied with, "There's a hose round the side." But the woman insisted on coming in. My father told her no, so she looked at him straight in the eyes, and that's where my dad saw it. Her eyes were completely black. She walked to the side of the house and proceeded to defecate on the sidewalk. My father lost track of her after that, and the next thing that happened was a bit strange. From that day onward for about a month, an owl would constantly fly and stand on the same place where she had done a duty. And that's all of the story. My father isn't usually a superstitious fellow, and even though it may sound a little bizarre, he's always told the same story.
I'm going to preface this by acknowledging the fact that this happened on April 1st. I'm not kidding at all. It just so happens that this happened on the day where nobody can take anyone seriously. I work in a factory during the graveyard shift from 10 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. This night I was actually working my 6th day in a row for overtime. I have had this job for a while now, and I am used to this kind of schedule. I'm bringing this up because typically after I get home, I'm still wide awake and tend to sleep later in the day. I was totally alert when this happened. I ended up leaving work early since I completed a lot more orders than usual and was on my way home around 4:30 a.m. I turned down the side street that leads to my apartment complex, and I immediately noticed it's quite dark, as the streetlights are not illuminated. The suburb I live around uses streetlights that have sensors, so they light up when people walk by them, and turn off by themselves to save energy. As I noticed it was dark, I decided to turn on my brights on my car. I'm only 6 blocks away from home at this point, and I come around a small bend in the road that leads to a children's park, and the only stop sign on the street between my apartment, which is a few blocks further. I noticed something in the middle of the road. My first thought was it was some garbage that maybe blew off the curb into the street. But as I drove closer, I slowed down, and I realized it was a person walking down the street with their back to me. It seemed like an old person, a very old person actually by the way they were walking. I slowed down a lot because it was very odd. I didn't know if they were going to jump in front of my car or what, since there are well-maintained sidewalks less than 10 feet away for them to use. The next thing I noticed is the clothing. The person was walking slowly, almost waddling, and was wearing a hooded jacket with the hood up and their hands inside the front pouch, sweatpants, and soaking wet slippers due to the light rain, without socks. This person was about 3 car lengths away from the stop sign, and I was close now, getting ready to stop and ask if they needed help or something. As soon as I was just about right behind him, this person, which I then saw was an old man with wrinkly and very pale skin, whipped around insanely fast and stared at me. My brights were still on, and I could see how pale his skin was. And then I saw the pitch black eyes. No whites in his eyes, just black. I was immediately filled with terror and almost froze up, but I floored it and sped the last few blocks to my apartment, parked, and sprinted inside, locking all my doors and windows. The next day, I realized that none of the street lights were illuminated on my whole street when this happened, even though it was within distance to trigger the sensors. I couldn't sleep at all that night. This happened April 1st, 2017.
This isn't my story per se, but is my mother's. My mother owns a salon in country suburbia, Philadelphia. I have been working for her since she opened, and I'm usually with her Wednesdays through Saturdays. Every Saturday, we have an older woman come in. We'll call her Ethel. Ethel usually washes her own hair, then sets it up to come and have it teased. It's literally a $4 service, and seems weird, but she's there every week for the same thing. I've never gotten a weird vibe from her, and have spent years talking to this woman. A few years ago I left work early with her closing up for the day. I felt safe knowing my mum only had one more client, and it would be no big deal. She's only there for a maximum of 10 more minutes. As I get home, I get a call from my mother, who's shaken up, but not terrified. She goes on to tell me that she was doing Ethel's hair, and she uncharacteristically turned around and looked at my mum. When their eyes met, she said that they were completely black, no whites at all. And as my mum looked back into the mirror, her eyes were normal again. It hasn't happened again, and this was the first time I'd heard of it, and I honestly dismissed it for the most part, until I came across a humanoid encounter that led me to these stories. Now, I believe I will stay late just to see Ethel and speak to her. I didn't believe in black-eyed kids until just recently. 2 of them came to my window. I live half underground, and my window is at ground level right above my bed. It is storming pretty good, and I had my blinds up watching the lightning, and then suddenly 2 of them walked right up to the window like a horror movie and knocked, slowly but sternly. I shot out of bed, drew the shade, and heard them say, "Please let us in. We're cold. Can we use your phone?" Immediately I shouted for them to leave, but they didn't move. Recalling what I had read about them possibly being demons, I yelled as loudly as I could, "Get away from here! Leave now! This is a house of God, or something like that. I kept yelling until the knocking stopped. I was scared out of my wits. And then finally one made eye contact through the crack in the shutters, and sure enough, its eyes were as black as could be. Like I was getting lost in the blackness and could not look away. And then they were gone. I'm honestly so terrified and shaking. I really wish I had never learned of these Satan spawns.
Fearcrawler here. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I greatly appreciate it. I also want to say a special thank you to Mortis Media for the opportunity here. If you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already done so, be sure that you're subscribed, and make sure you hit that little bell thingy, because if you don't, well, you're only going to regret it in the morning. If you guys did want to check out my channel, it will be linked in the video description below. On my channel you'll find a lot of original horror stories that I've written, as well as some true crime stories, true horror stories, and the occasional funny skits at the beginning of some of my videos. And if you guys did want to subscribe to my channel, that is also greatly appreciated. Don't forget that voting is this Saturday, so if you did enjoy what I did here, voting for me is greatly appreciated. Besides, I'll love you forever. No, seriously, I will. So until next time, take care, be safe, and stay scared.